I returned home earlier than expected that Tuesday afternoon, and what I witnessed through the half-open door made my blood run cold. My daughter-in-law, Linda, was viciously yanking the crutches from my son Daniel's grasp while screaming directly into his face with a venom I'd never heard before. "Stop pretending to be the victim. You're nothing but a worthless burden on this family." Through the crack in the bedroom door, I could see my 6-year-old grandson, Matthew, huddled in the corner, his tiny body trembling violently as tears streamed down his terrified face. Every instinct told me to burst through that door, but something made me hold back. I needed to think carefully about my next move. I quietly retreated, pretending I had seen nothing. But by the next morning, everything had changed. I gathered my son and grandson, and we left for a new house I had secretly purchased. All I left behind for Linda was a single envelope on the kitchen table. When she opened it hours later, her screams of rage could be heard throughout the entire neighborhood. I stepped off the bus that afternoon clutching a warm bag of fresh cinnamon rolls, my favorite treat to bring home to the family. In my coat pocket, my fingers traced the outline of the new house keys. Keys to a beautiful property in Riverside that I had just finished purchasing. My heart swelled with anticipation as I imagined the looks of pure surprise and happiness on Daniel and Linda's faces when I revealed this generous gift was meant for them. The familiar cobblestone pathway leading to our house came into view, but something immediately felt wrong. The weathered green iron gate, which I always made certain to lock securely whenever leaving or entering, stood partially open. A chill ran down my spine. I pushed the gate gently, and it swung inward without resistance. The front courtyard was eerily silent, except for flowering jasmine bushes rustling softly in the afternoon breeze. I was about to call out my usual cheerful greeting, but a harsh, cutting voice from inside the house froze the words in my throat. "What are you doing? You can't even pour a simple glass of water without making a complete mess. Look at this disaster you created." It was Linda's voice, but this wasn't the melodious, sweet tone she always used when speaking to me. This voice was sharp as broken glass, cold as winter frost, dripping with pure contempt and mockery. My heart lurched painfully in my chest. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath, and crept cautiously toward the living room window. The delicate lace curtain didn't completely obscure the view inside. Through a small gap, I had just enough visibility to see what was happening. On the pristine white tile floor lay the shattered remains of a drinking glass. Water pooled across the surface in an expanding puddle. Daniel, my beloved son, was hunched awkwardly over the mess, struggling desperately to collect the largest glass fragments using only his left hand, his only remaining functional hand. His entire posture radiated vulnerability and defeat, and watching him in that position shattered something deep inside my soul. At that moment, Linda approached him. Somewhere in the depths of my heart, I held on to a foolish hope that she would bend down to help him, to offer comfort to her struggling husband. But instead, she reached out her hand, not to assist him, but to violently rip away his support crutch. "Stop this pathetic victim act. You're nothing more than a burden weighing down this entire family." Each word emerged through clenched teeth, striking like hammer blows against my chest. Then, before my paralyzed, disbelieving eyes, Linda hurled the metal crutch forcefully to the ground. It struck the tile with a sharp, cruel clatter that echoed through the room. Without his support, Daniel lost his balance immediately and collapsed heavily onto the nearby sofa. His face drained of all color, becoming as pale as fresh paper. He lowered his head in submission, his disheveled hair falling forward to conceal his eyes, not daring to meet his wife's gaze. This man who had once been so proud, such a brilliant and accomplished engineer, was now reduced to nothing more than a broken, silent shadow of his former self. In that instant of chilling silence, my eyes drifted toward the hallway, and I felt as though an invisible hand was squeezing my heart with crushing force. Matthew, my precious little grandson, stood hidden behind the bedroom door. At barely 6 years old, he clutched his threadbare teddy bear tightly against his chest, his small shoulders shaking uncontrollably with suppressed sobs. Tears carved 2 glistening paths down his round, innocent cheeks. His eyes, filled with absolute horror, looked through the narrow opening and locked directly with mine across the distance. His lips moved silently, forming the word grandma. I quickly pressed a finger to my lips, urgently signaling him to remain quiet. I shook my head slowly, fighting back the sob threatening to escape my own throat. My look conveyed everything I couldn't say aloud. Don't make a sound, my darling. I can't let your mother discover I'm here. Not yet. Not until I understand what's truly happening in this house. Linda stormed furiously toward the bedroom, slamming the door with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. I retreated quickly, pressing myself against the exterior wall to remain hidden. The initial trembling shock coursing through my body gradually gave way to an icy, crystalline calm. A clarity of purpose settled over me. I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't simply burst inside. I couldn't create a dramatic confrontation at that moment. Doing so would only allow Linda to deny everything, to spin lies and manipulate the situation. Daniel would feel even more ashamed and humiliated, and Matthew would be terrified beyond measure. I backed away silently to the gate, taking several deep breaths to calm the crushing pain in my chest. Then, quite deliberately, I pushed the iron gate forcefully, causing it to emit a long, piercing squeak, loud enough for everyone inside the house to hear clearly. Immediately, I raised my voice to a normal, cheerful volume. "Daniel, Linda, I'm home." Almost instantly, I heard the bedroom door fly open. Hurried footsteps echoed through the house, followed by urgent whispers and the unmistakable sound of items being frantically moved and rearranged. Mere seconds later, Linda appeared at the front entrance. Her face had transformed completely. A radiant, welcoming smile now graced her features, and her gaze had softened to resemble peaceful lake water on an autumn afternoon. "Mom, what a wonderful surprise. You're home so early today. It would have been lovely if you called ahead to let me know you were coming." She approached warmly and naturally linked her arm through mine, gently pulling me toward the house entrance. "Please come inside, Mom. It's terribly sunny and hot out here." That same hand, the one that mere minutes ago had viciously snatched the crutches from my disabled son, was now clinging affectionately to my arm with an Oscar-worthy performance of daughterly devotion. Upon crossing the threshold into the living room, I found Daniel already sitting upright on the sofa. His crutches were positioned neatly and properly by his side, exactly as they should be. The shattered glass fragments had completely vanished, as though they had never existed at all. Only a barely visible damp spot on the floor remained as evidence of what had truly transpired. Linda settled herself quickly beside Daniel, placing her hand on his shoulder with what appeared to be a tender, loving caress. She spoke to him with sickeningly sweet affection. "Are you tired, my love? Would you like me to bring you some fresh orange juice?" My son barely moved his head in response, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I noticed how unconsciously he tugged down the sleeve of his shirt, a minimal gesture, but significant enough for me to observe that he was attempting to conceal a bruise that was beginning to form on his arm. Linda's flawless performance continued throughout dinner at the table. She never stopped serving both Daniel and me, talking incessantly about amusing incidents from her workday, a clumsy co-worker, a ridiculous customer, funny office gossip. Her smile remained impeccable, her voice crystal clear and bright, as though absolutely nothing had happened earlier. But that manufactured cheerfulness felt terribly out of place in that house. It didn't warm the atmosphere whatsoever. It only made the underlying coldness more starkly evident. I tried to swallow the stew she prepared, but it tasted bitter as bile in my mouth. Daniel simply kept his head lowered in silence, pushing individual grains of rice around his plate with his left hand. He wasn't eating. He was merely pretending to eat. Every time Linda directed conversation toward him, he would only nod or shake his head without uttering a single word. Matthew, sitting directly across from me, kept glancing at me sideways with obvious worry etched on his young face. He ate rapidly, as though desperately wanting to escape from that table as quickly as possible. No one genuinely responded to Linda's forced monologue. That warm family meal I had once cherished so deeply had transformed into a silent, suffocating farce, a performance built entirely on falsehood and hidden cruelty. "Mom, would you care for more soup? I made your favorite, the creamy pumpkin one," Linda offered, breaking through the uncomfortable silence. I shook my head firmly and set down my utensils with deliberate finality. I'm quite full, thank you. The journey home was somewhat tiring today. I think I'll rest early this evening. It was merely an excuse. The truth was that I couldn't endure remaining at that table for even one more second. I stood up and walked directly toward Matthew. He squeezed me so tightly that I could feel his little heart pounding with uncontrolled force against my side. He bared his head against me and whispered so softly that only I could hear his plea. "Please don't go, Grandma. Please stay." That whispered phrase pierced my heart like a needle driven straight through. This wasn't a child's simple whim or momentary tantrum. This was a desperate plea from a terrified soul crying out for protection. I bent down, embraced him tightly, and gave him several soft, reassuring pats on the back. "I'm staying right here with you, my darling," I whispered in response. It wasn't merely a comforting promise. It was an absolute vow. Upon entering my bedroom, I chose not to turn on the overhead light. The silvery moonlight filtered through the window, casting blurred, dancing shadows across the floor. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed, gazing out at the dark silhouettes of trees whose leaves whispered secrets to the night wind. Sleep felt like an impossible luxury tonight, something I would not be able to afford. I reached out and picked up the framed photograph from my nightstand. A fine layer of dust covered the glass like morning mist, partially obscuring the past captured within. It was a family portrait taken on the sun-drenched beach in Florida 3 years earlier, just before tragedy had descended upon our lives like a dark storm. In the photograph, Daniel carried Matthew joyfully on his broad shoulders. The boy had his small arms raised high, like a superhero taking flight, and both father and son were laughing with pure, uninhibited happiness beneath the golden afternoon sunlight. Linda, wearing an elegant white maxi dress, her long hair flowing gracefully in the sea breeze, rested her head sweetly against her husband's shoulder. And there I stood beside them, my arms wrapped protectively around my entire small family. We had once resembled a perfect postcard, a family that inspired envy in anyone who looked upon us. The memories struck me like an avalanche of emotion. I remembered those breezy Sunday afternoons when Daniel, an exceptionally talented mechanical engineer with remarkably skillful hands, would spend countless hours in our patio carefully repairing Matthew's old bicycle. The metallic clink of tools, his patient voice explaining every mechanical component to his eager son, all mixing with the child's crystal-clear laughter. These sounds had once represented pure happiness. In the kitchen during those golden days, Linda would prepare her specialty honey-glazed roasted ribs, their mouth-watering aroma drifting throughout the entire small garden. Happiness back then had been so simple, so tangible, so real. And then I remembered the fateful trip to the Rocky Mountains that had destroyed everything. We were driving along a treacherous mountain road filled with sharp curves, with a steep cliff dropping away on one side and an imposing rock wall rising on the other. I was in the back seat, telling Matthew an enchanting fairy tale about a brave prince on a quest, when suddenly a massive cargo truck lost control on a curve just ahead of us. The vehicle swayed like a drunken monster before launching directly toward our car. "Look out!" Daniel shouted, gripping the steering wheel with all his strength, turning it desperately with every ounce of force he possessed. I only managed to hear a thunderous, earth-shattering boom that seemed to tear the very air apart. Our car was thrown violently through the air, flipping end over end multiple times before finally stopping with horrifying proximity to the edge of the precipice. I dragged myself out of the wreckage, completely stunned, my entire body covered with painful scrapes and blood. A grandmother's first instinct, a mother's deepest instinct, compelled me to immediately search for the children. I quickly pulled Linda and Matthew from the back seat, where they were crying inconsolably but appeared to have sustained only minor injuries. When I looked back toward the front of the vehicle, I felt my heart completely stop beating. Daniel was trapped in the driver's seat. The severely deformed dashboard had imprisoned his legs in a twisted metal cage. Black smoke began pouring from beneath the crumpled hood. The overpowering smell of leaking gasoline announced the imminent catastrophe approaching. "Daniel, my son," I screamed desperately while attempting to wrench open the car door, which had been completely mangled in the impact. Several local residents who happened to be passing by immediately ran to assist us. Together, we used wooden planks and our combined strength to pry the deformed door open inch by agonizing inch. Quickly, "The car's going to explode," one man shouted with absolute desperation in his voice. We managed to extract Daniel's unconscious body and drag him approximately 10 meters away from the wreckage, just seconds before a deafening explosion shook the entire mountainside. An enormous ball of fire completely enveloped our car. The powerful shock wave threw all of us violently to the ground. In the hospital, the overwhelming smell of disinfectant and a thick, oppressive silence covered everything like a suffocating blanket. Linda sobbed uncontrollably on my shoulder, her entire body trembling with shock and fear. The surgeon, an older gentleman with an exhausted, careworn face, finally emerged from the operating room after what felt like an eternity. He informed us that my son had survived the ordeal, but to save his life, the medical team had been forced to amputate his right arm and his left leg below the knee. The first months following the accident were absolute hell, but we faced them together as a family unit. Linda remained present during those dark days, demonstrating remarkable patience. She carefully spooned soup into Daniel's mouth when he couldn't manage it himself. She accompanied him to the excruciating physical rehabilitation sessions, encouraging him through his tears of pain and frustration. I had to request additional hours working at an old bookstore downtown just to help pay the mounting hospital bills. Watching Linda care so attentively for my son during that period, I genuinely believe her love was strong enough to weather any storm life could bring. But I was tragically wrong. Love doesn't always die from one powerful blow. Sometimes it deteriorates through 1,000 small daily wounds, tiny cuts that accumulate until the relationship bleeds out completely. The arguments between them started becoming more frequent. Then came Linda's constant complaints about electricity bills, about the cost of medications, about every small expense. Her overtime hours at work became increasingly common, and each night she returned home with a progressively colder and more exhausted expression on her face. I remember perfectly one particular afternoon when Daniel attempted to hang the laundry using only one hand. He was clumsy and inexperienced, and he accidentally dropped Linda's expensive silk blouse into a muddy puddle of dirty water in the patio. That evening when Linda arrived home and discovered the ruined shirt, she didn't say a single word. She simply picked it up between two fingers with obvious disgust and threw it directly into the laundry basket with an expression of pure contempt that she didn't even bother trying to hide. In that precise moment, I knew something fundamental had broken between them, something that might never be repaired. I placed the picture frame back on the table, this time face down. I no longer wanted to look at those fake, frozen smiles. The memories that had once been my greatest treasure had transformed into sharp fragments that tore mercilessly at my heart. I had been lying to myself for far too long. I had blindly believed in that pleasant smile and the kind words Linda always spoke to me, without realizing that everything was merely a carefully constructed mask concealing something dark and cruel beneath. I heard Matthew cough softly in his sleep in the adjacent room. The vivid image of his red, trembling eyes from earlier that afternoon returned to my mind with painful clarity. How many times had he been forced to witness scenes like today's horror? How long had he been living with that consuming fear eating away at his innocent childhood? All doubt evaporated from my mind. My patience and silence weren't protecting anyone. They were only permitting evil to continue flourishing unchecked. I would not allow my son and grandson to live even one more day in this hell disguised as a normal home. I rose from bed when dawn mist still hung heavy in the air. I hadn't slept at all during the night. I had simply sat in the darkness, allowing my decision to harden and crystallize in my chest until it became unbreakable resolve. I tiptoed out of my room without making the slightest sound on the cold floor. In the quiet kitchen, I took a sheet of paper from my old recipe notebook, its pages yellowed with age. I opened the pencil box and withdrew the wooden pen Daniel had given me years ago on a Mother's Day celebration when he was still a young engineer bursting with pride and promise. The ink flowed smoothly across the paper as I carefully wrote several lines. I didn't insult Linda. I didn't level accusations. I didn't use harsh or inflammatory words. Just a plain truth, cold and direct. Linda, we need some time away. Please do not attempt to find us. Helen, just that. Sometimes the truth requires no further explanation. I folded the letter precisely, placed it inside a clean white envelope, and sealed it carefully. I left it prominently visible on the dining table, leaning against the salt and pepper shakers where it absolutely could not be ignored or overlooked. That simple note represented my farewell to our previous life, to the lie I had unintentionally enabled for far too long. With my old cell phone clutched in my hand, I stepped out into the backyard. The fresh morning air made me shiver, but also cleared my head with remarkable clarity. I dialed Betty's number, the only friend I truly trusted with the secret. The phone rang only once before she answered, as though she had been waiting anxiously for my call. "Betty," I whispered urgently, "it's time. Can you come at 9 o'clock sharp? Just bring your silver car, and please don't honk the horn when you arrive." On the other end of the line, her voice came through firm and certain, without a moment's hesitation. "Understood completely. I'll be waiting at the beginning of the alley at 9 o'clock. Stay calm, Helen. Everything is going to work out fine." Her words functioned like a sedative, calming my racing thoughts. I disconnected the call and breathed deeply of the clean dawn air. When I returned inside, Linda was already awake. She stood in the kitchen doorway, smiling at me as though the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream that had faded with morning light. "Good morning, Mom. Did you sleep well?" I nodded my head while forcing a smile in return. I busied myself making coffee, as I did every morning. The familiar hum of the coffee maker helped disguise the wild, irregular beating of my anxious heart. Linda even said cheerfully, "I'm going to try my best to come home early today. Shall we make a special seafood stew together, Mom? We haven't all eaten together as a family for such a long time. Daniel is really going to love it." I only responded with a brief yes before turning around, pretending to be completely concentrated on preparing the coffee. A seafood stew, a family meal together. The irony was almost unbearable. How bitter those words tasted. At 8 o'clock precisely, Linda took her motorcycle out to the front gate to depart for work. The instant the iron gate closed with its characteristic dry clack, I felt as though an invisible pressure that had been suffocating this entire house was suddenly lifted and removed. I acted immediately without hesitation. I entered Daniel's bedroom. My son was still sitting on the edge of his bed with deeply sunken eyes, his face appearing tired and completely empty of emotion. He clearly hadn't been able to sleep. I knew it instinctively. "Daniel," I told her with a quiet but absolutely firm voice, "we're going to take a few days away, you, Matthew, and I, to breathe some fresh air and clear our heads." He looked up at me, clearly surprised, his lips beginning to tremble as though he wanted to ask questions or raise objections. But upon seeing my expression, which left absolutely no room for refusal or debate, he simply nodded in silence. His immediate obedience broke something inside my soul. I opened his closet and quickly gathered several changes of comfortable clothing, the bottle of prescription painkillers he took daily, his special orthopedic pillow, and the astrophysics textbook he had left half-read on his nightstand. We didn't pack extensively, just the bare necessities, as though we were genuinely departing for a brief vacation of just a few days. Afterward, I went to Matthew's room. The door stood slightly ajar. The boy was already awake, sitting quietly on his bed while hugging his beloved teddy bear. He looked directly at me without blinking, with a mature and pain-filled look that seemed impossibly old for such a young child, that sharp intuition possessed only by children who have suffered far too much. I sat beside him on the bed, gently stroking his soft hair. "Matthew, we're going on a trip together." "Okay, sweetheart." The boy didn't ask where we were going or why. He simply climbed down from his bed in silence, walked to his small desk, and retrieved his turtle-shaped backpack. He independently packed his box of colored crayons and his drawing notebook. He accomplished everything in a silence that physically hurt to witness. At 9 o'clock sharp, I peered through the narrow crack in the window curtain. Betty's silver Ford was already parked discreetly at the end of the alley, exactly as promised. "Let's go, my loves," I announced quietly. I helped Daniel stand and position himself securely on his crutches. "Matthew, without being told or instructed, grabbed his backpack, and followed us without question. We carried only 2 lightweight bags. Everything else, the accumulated memories, the furniture, all the objects that fill the house, we left behind. Betty didn't honk her horn. She simply exited her vehicle, opened the trunk, and silently took the bags from my hands with understanding efficiency. We climbed into the car without exchanging words. The engine started smoothly, and we pulled away slowly, leaving that alley and departing from that house filled with wounds and lies. During the entire drive to Riverside, the atmosphere inside the car remained dense and heavy with unspoken emotion. Daniel stared out the window in silence, his gaze lost among the passing trees and houses streaming by. I didn't know what thoughts occupied his mind. Perhaps reflections on what he was leaving behind, contemplation of the pain, or maybe just a delayed sensation of relief finally washing over him. Matthew fell asleep in the back seat. Perhaps he, too, hadn't slept the previous night. Even while sleeping, he continued clutching his teddy bear as though it were a lifesaver, keeping him afloat in turbulent waters. The new house welcomed us with brilliant sunshine and a faint, pleasant scent of fresh paint lingering in the air. It wasn't as large as our previous home, but it felt bright, genuinely cozy, with a small garden and a flowering bush producing clusters of beautiful fuchsia blooms. This represented a genuine new beginning. Betty helped me carry our belongings inside. Before departing, she squeezed my hand tightly and said with heartfelt sincerity, "If you need anything at all, call me immediately." I mean that seriously. Then she left us to begin our new life. When the front door closed, it was just the 3 of us standing together in the middle of the profound silence. I prepared a pot of hot chamomile tea. I placed a steaming cup in front of Daniel and seated myself in the chair directly opposite him. It was time to confront the truth directly. I looked him straight in the eyes with a serene but firm voice. "I saw everything yesterday, Daniel. I witnessed what Linda did to you." He didn't attempt to deny it, nor did he try to justify her actions or defend her behavior. His broad shoulders slumped forward as though he were finally removing an enormous weight that had been crushing him for months. He lowered his head and murmured with deep shame coloring his words, "It's been going on for almost a year now, Mom. But please don't blame her. She's tired and overwhelmed by everything. I'm no longer capable of properly supporting my family financially. I'm completely useless." The words of self-reproach he directed at himself cut through my soul like sharp knives. I extended my hand and squeezed his remaining hand tightly, the one that hadn't been injured. "You are absolutely not useless, Daniel. You are a brave survivor who faced unimaginable tragedy. But you were wrong to stay silent about the abuse. You were wrong to allow her to hurt you repeatedly. And the biggest mistake of all was permitting Matthew to witness everything over and over again, allowing that trauma to scar his young soul. Look at what this environment has done to him. Do you genuinely want him to continue living in this atmosphere of emotional violence forever?" Upon hearing Matthew's name mentioned, Daniel's head shot up suddenly. His eyes filled with profound pain and deep, crushing remorse. Silence enveloped us, but this time it wasn't oppressive or uncomfortable. It was a silence of mutual understanding finally achieved. After a long while, he nodded slowly, the gesture weighted with the gravity of acceptance. Then he stood up without saying another word and walked back to his bedroom in silence, closing the door quietly behind him. That night, after we shared a simple dinner of fresh bread and vegetable soup, I put Matthew to bed. The exhausted boy fell asleep almost instantly, hugging his worn teddy bear tightly against his small chest. Daniel had locked himself in his bedroom since late afternoon, immediately following our difficult conversation. I didn't knock on his door to disturb him, nor did I call him for dinner. I understood instinctively that my son needed that private space. He needed solitude to face the harsh truth that the marriage he had struggled so desperately to maintain had rotted away from within. I remained alone in the living room beneath the warm, dim light. My soul was far from peaceful. A part of me stayed on high alert, waiting and anticipating the storm I knew would inevitably arrive as soon as Linda discovered the truth of our departure. I retrieved my old tablet from my bag. 1 year earlier, I had convinced my children to install security cameras in the living room and entrance, using the excuse that neighborhood robberies were increasing in frequency. But deep down, perhaps I had already sensed another type of danger, one that originated from inside the house itself rather than from external threats. I opened the security app with a trembling finger. I selected the camera positioned in the corner of the living room. The screen displayed a familiar image: the sofa where Daniel had collapsed the day before, the coffee table, the vase containing artificial flowers covered with accumulated dust. The room appeared empty and silent beneath the harsh electric lighting. I did nothing but wait. I simply sat watching like a spectator, awaiting the dramatic climax of an inevitable tragedy. Around 7 in the evening, the front door visible on the screen opened. Linda entered. She looked tired after a full day of work, but her expression seemed quite happy, even somewhat enthusiastic. She was carrying a small bakery box. Tiramisu, the dessert everyone in our household enjoyed. Perhaps she was attempting to compensate for what she had done the previous day. Or perhaps it was simply another component of her elaborate performance. "Mom, Daniel, Matthew, I'm home. I brought the tiramisu you all love so much." Her voice sounded genuinely cheerful and bright, but the only response was the echo of silence bouncing off empty walls. Her smile faded gradually. She placed a cake box on the table, and an expression of growing confusion appeared on her face. "Where's everyone?" she called out again, this time considerably louder, but still no one answered. She began searching the house. I watched the camera as she passed through the frame, entered the kitchen, then headed toward the bedrooms. Several minutes later, she returned to the living room. The initial confusion had transformed into obvious annoyance and rising impatience. It was then that her eyes landed on the white envelope I had deliberately left positioned on the table. She approached quickly, snatched it up abruptly, and tore it open with impatient fingers. Through the screen, although the resolution wasn't perfect, I could clearly observe how her eyes scanned rapidly across the few lines I had written. Within seconds, her face underwent a series of terrifying transformations, from initial surprise to complete shock, and then slowly became tinged with furious red produced by absolutely uncontrollable rage. She pressed her thin lips together tightly, her jaw clenching with visible force. "Damn interfering old woman!" she screamed, a sharp, piercing scream overflowing with pure hatred that echoed throughout the empty house. That scream seemed to pierce through the screen itself and strike me directly in the ears. She crumpled the letter violently in her fist and hurled it to the floor as though it were worthless trash. And then her fury exploded like a volcano that had been dormant for far too long. She raised her leg and kicked the nearby armchair viciously, sending it flying several meters across the room. Still not satisfied, her rage not yet calmed, she turned toward the table and with a violent sweep of her arm knocked the cake box to the floor. Crash! The cake went flying, with cream and cocoa powder scattering across the pristine white floor, a chaotic and dirty scene that perfectly reflected her soul. At that moment, she began pacing frantically from one side of the room to the other, like a caged wild beast, cursing nonstop, unleashing a stream of profanity I never imagined hearing emerge from my daughter-in-law's mouth. How dare she leave? How dare she take my son without asking my permission first? He belongs to me. The burden is mine to control. Without my permission, no one, absolutely no one, has the right to take him away. That phrase left me frozen in place. The burden is mine. That wasn't love speaking. That was possession, ownership. For Linda, Daniel wasn't a husband with whom to share life's journey, but rather a possession, an object over which she maintained absolute control, including what she believed was her right to mistreat him however she wished. Immediately afterward, she pulled out her cell phone. Almost simultaneously, mine began vibrating in my pocket. On the screen appeared Linda's name. I stared at it calmly, allowing it to ring repeatedly, letting her insist in vain. Call rejected. Another call came through, and another. Daniel's cell phone, which he had forgotten on the table beside me since the afternoon, also began vibrating and lighting up frantically. Her madness was attempting to extend its grasping tentacles here, trying to reach us. I picked up my cell phone. Without hesitating for even a moment, I searched for Linda's name in my contacts and pressed the block button. I managed to glimpse one final message in the notification bar before it disappeared, written entirely in aggressive capital letters. Answer right now, or don't blame me for what happens next. I deleted it calmly, without a second thought. Then I took Daniel's phone and repeated the blocking process. All calls, all messages, completely blocked. The firewall was now activated and operational. On the tablet screen, I observed how Linda nearly went insane, seeing that absolutely no one was answering her increasingly desperate attempts at contact. She threw her cell phone violently onto the sofa and collapsed with her hands covering her head, breaking into bitter crying. These were tears of rage, of complete helplessness, of the sudden realization that her prey had successfully escaped the cage she constructed. I turned off the tablet in silence. The screen went black, reflecting my expressionless face in its dark surface. I didn't want to watch anymore. I had already seen more than enough. The next morning, I woke early to prepare breakfast. Just some scrambled eggs, a couple of crispy toast slices, and glasses of warm milk. Matthew sat at the kitchen table with his little legs dangling freely, concentrated intently on coloring in his notebook. From time to time, he would look up with bright, shining eyes to show me a new drawing. This one depicting our house surrounded by a vine of purple flowers and featuring a large, smiling sun. His smile was no longer fearful or anxious as it had been before. And one beautiful morning, for the first time in many months, I heard Matthew laugh loudly, a free, uninhibited laugh bursting with pure innocence. It happened when a little sparrow landed boldly on our kitchen windowsill, tilting its tiny head to look curiously at us. Matthew, absolutely delighted, tried to imitate its cheerful song, though quite clumsily. His clear and contagious laughter filled the entire house, penetrating every corner, and helped dissipate much of the shadow that still lingered from our painful past. That innocent laugh was worth more than anything else in the world. It served as undeniable proof that my decision to leave had been absolutely correct. However, ghosts from the past don't vanish so easily. One afternoon while I was watering the potted plants on the porch, Matthew ran outside and tugged urgently on the hem of my blouse. He raised his clear eyes to mine and asked a question that squeezed my heart painfully. "Grandma, does Mom know where we are? Will she come looking for me?" In that innocent question existed both hope and fear intertwined. He remained a child. He still loved his mother despite everything, but he was also genuinely afraid of her. I bent down and hugged his small body tightly against mine, desperately searching for an answer that wouldn't cause him additional pain.